There is no peace among the stars, only the laughter of greedy gods. Despite the vast expanses of the galaxy, in the grim darkness of the far future, it is quite challenging to find a place or a period that could unequivocally be called a golden age. Some might recall the times of the Great Crusade or even the dark era of technology, but even during these seemingly triumphant times of mankind, there were far too many ways to suffer a terrible and agonizing death. And at all times it so happened that some people were somewhat luckier than others, lucky to be born in a relatively calm slice of history, in a more developed state, in a more fortunate family than many less fortunate could boast. But in the galaxy of the far future, it is much easier to find a place and time where the chances of living to old age are close to absolute zero, rather than a place where one could live out a modest yet long life. For example, few would wish to find themselves a resident of Terra at the beginning of the 36th millennium, when the era of apostasy began. The blackest of epochs, the saddest of times, and let no one remember the name of the one who doomed us. The second period of civil war in the history of the Imperium of Man, which flared up due to disagreements between the ecclesiarchy and the administratum. By the 34th millennium, the power of the ecclesiarchy had spread into all aspects of life in the Imperium, from ordinary miners and clerks to planetary governors and the High Lords of Terra. All were devoted to the imperial faith, at least in theory. In practice, the High Lords periodically yielded to the ecclesiarch, believing he represented the eye of the emperor. In turn, the Adeptus Ministorum remained inactive and did not obstruct this state of affairs. The power of the ecclesiarchy grew, a situation that did not suit certain sectors of the Imperium. At the Council of High Lords, the Fabricator General of the Adeptus Mechanicus openly opposed the will of the ecclesiarchy, and many orders of the Adeptus Astartes also questioned the orders coming from it. With their help, the administratum began to combat the growing power of the ecclesiarchy. At this time, Goge van Dyer was elected the 361st Master of the Administratum and immediately appeared as an opponent of the absolute power of the Adeptus Ministorum. Among the High Lords of Terra, the practice of subtly manipulating other branches of imperial authority, including the ecclesiarchy, was widespread. Nonetheless, Van Dyer was not inclined to constantly resort to such methods, activating his plans to gain power over the imperial church. After assembling a military group, Van Dyer attacked the ecclesiarchy's palace on the planet Ophelia VII and declared the incumbent ecclesiarch, Paulus III, a traitor, after which he mercilessly executed him. Subsequently, Goge van Dyer took on dual duties as the head of both the administratum and the ecclesiarchy. Being simultaneously the ecclesiarch and the master of the administratum, Van Dyer became the most powerful figure in the Imperium. At the peak of his might, he effectively controlled not just the administratum and the ecclesiarchy, but also the Officio Assassinorum, the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, and the Imperial Guard. As Van Dyer's power grew, he began systematically exterminating all the cardinals and officials of the ecclesiarchy who opposed him. Many cardinals attempted to flee Terra, but as they entered the Immaterium, a strong warp storm arose, destroying the fugitive ship. Van Dyer declared this a sign from the Emperor God himself, after which he began filling the vacant cardinal positions with his loyal servants. Unsurprisingly, such a concentration of power eventually turned into tyranny. Despite Goge van Dyer's noble aspirations to free the empire from the excessive influence of the ecclesiarchy, his own rule proved far worse. He quickly demonstrated his own madness, taking great pleasure in torturing anyone regardless of their guilt or innocence, claiming in this way he purified their souls. It was said that he would fall into trances, during which he muttered or even loudly screamed, later claiming he had received a message from the God Emperor. These messages were followed by acts of extreme cruelty towards his subjects. Yet despite nearly a century of his rule, Van Dyer hindered too many, and eventually Terra was besieged again. This time, however, the siege was not led by a mad traitor under the influence of destructive forces. On the contrary, the warriors storming Terra were convinced they were fulfilling the will of the Emperor. A vast army supported by the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Adeptus Astartes descended upon the cradle of humanity, and ultimately the tyrant fell, struck down by his own warrior. Making pilgrimages to Terra, or being its permanent resident at the height of this conflict, was far from the best idea unless you intended to become a direct participant. Even if we discount all obvious outcomes, such as being torn apart by the bolts of the Sororitas or Astartes, being burned by a plasma salvo from a Titan or an orbital strike, the very necessity of choosing a side in such a conflict is more than a dubious pleasure, especially when both sides proclaim their sanctity and brand each other as heretics. However, even when the goals are clear, when you know for sure you are fighting for the truth and that you are led into battle by the Emperor himself, things might not be so straightforward. When people talk about the Great Crusade, they speak of humanity's triumph, of times of glory and fulfilled dreams, of how the disparate worlds of humans were finally reunited under the light of Terra, and how the Emperor once again opened the way to the stars for humanity. Yet many forget that times of glory often mean times of great sacrifices. Blinded by the triumphs of the Astartes legions, many forget the numerous armies of ordinary people who, although significantly different from the familiar Imperial Guard, largely shared their fate. After all, at the end of the day, there is no difference in the trench whether you carry the banner of a Guard regiment, the Imperial Army, or even the proud Solar Auxilia, and the difference between a commissar and an overseer is merely in uniform. And this army requires people no less than the regiments of the Imperial Guard, who will likewise be forced to fight against the horrors of space, and while the Astartes are likely to be at the spearhead of any attack. Does it really matter at the moment when an Orc Gargant immediately aims its weapon at your position? However, one must not forget those who were on the other side of the campaign. Imagine that your star system has been isolated from the rest of space for thousands of years, but you are lucky. You have preserved the technologies of your ancestors. You have not degenerated into barbarism. On the contrary, your society has developed and flourished. And by the 30th millennium, you fully control your system, live in your own constructed utopia, and most likely don't even maintain an army because there is simply no one to fight with. And for thousands of years, not even the orcs have come knocking. And then, ships of the Imperium appear above your planet. The fleeting joy of reunification with distant kin quickly dims with a simple ultimatum: compliance or flame, and you have no choice but to accept it. For even if you had armed forces, it is unlikely they could truly stand against these warriors in power armor. And now, all your high-tech production is under the control of the tech priest. Your utopia is shattered by imperial laws and orders. Perhaps a governor not of your own will be appointed to your planet. It will be an officer from the Imperial Army among the high commanders, who are about, for some reason, to be removed from the expedition. A hereditary aristocrat from a planet at the other end of the galaxy will rule as well as he can. And under the banner of the Aquila, your society of complete well-being slowly regresses into a long-extinct and even forgotten feudalism. Money, something you have never heard of, appears on the planet, and you have to find a way to acquire it. For instance, at the new Manufactorum, which now occupies a quarter of the continent. Welcome. Work shifts are 16 hours, no holidays or weekends, but do not worry. In case of a serious injury at the factory, you will be immediately sent for servitization. If anything is unsatisfactory, there is always an alternative. You can join the Imperial Army. Of course, this is not an ordinary case. The Great Crusade indeed brought deliverance to many worlds. The warriors of the Emperor liberated people from the yoke of Xenos or the perverse intellect, pulled peoples from barbarism, and found those who had long forgotten that there existed others beyond their world. Yet sometimes darker events occurred, such as the fate of planet 4716, discovered by the Legion of the Word-Bearers. The inhabitants of the planet were fully prepared to embrace the imperial truth, and were even interested in the Legion's faith, as they had somehow obtained a copy of the Lectitio Divinitatus. However, the recent fate of the monarchy and reproaches for slow progress have already determined the fate of this world. Despite the planet's complete agreement, Lorgar ordered a military campaign. Indeed, if even at the dawn of humanity there were ample ways to die, what to say about its darkest hour, the Great Rift, a colossal warp storm that engulfed the galaxy at the end of the 41st millennium. Even before the fall of Cadia, the Materium showed signs of increasing turbulence. Travel and communication suffered from the growing unrest in the warp. The events of the 13th Black Crusade served as a catalyst for this process. The Materium could not withstand, and a huge warp rift enveloped the galaxy, stretching from the Terra to the Hadex anomaly in the eastern fringe. The Great Rift is a tear in the fabric of reality, splitting the Imperium into two. Its emergence literally broke the galaxy apart, plunged the Imperium into chaos, and marked the beginning of new wars for its worlds. So mighty and vast is this storm that the very laws of physics cease to operate, and temporal paradoxes, once confined to places like the Eye of Terror, are now encountered across the galaxy. Some worlds felt the weight of centuries in mere seconds. Others almost froze in time, while others suffered from temporal rifts. The part of the galaxy cut off from the guiding light of the Astronomicon was named Imperium Nihilus, or the Dark Imperium. The exact reasons for the rift's appearance are unknown, but there are many theories. The breach of the Cadian Gate, the sorcery of the demonic Primarch Magnus the Red during the siege of the Fenris system, the destruction of parts of the Webway, or the massive bloodsheds and fires in the Damocles Gulf. Perhaps all these factors contributed to it. Gradually realizing the nightmarish realities of the galaxy altered by the Great Rift, the Imperium strived to adapt to this new, dreadful situation. There were no longer worlds of shields or bastion systems. Henceforth, any planet, even sacred Terra, was on the front line for the survival of humanity. One can talk a lot about the difficulty of surviving in the Age of Darkness. You could fall during the defense of Cadia, holding back the hordes of demons and traitor Astartes, perish in an overwhelming crusade, or even rot alive in the Plague Warriors, defending Ultramar. But imagine yourself in the place of those whose home was where the Great Rift now lies. No matter who you were, a mutant, a labourer, an arbitrator, or an aristocrat, your entire world suddenly found itself in an impossible hell, in the realm of the Immaterium, where even death would not grant relief. Literally anything could happen to you because of events on the other end of the galaxy, over which you had not only no influence but also no awareness. Without a chance to do anything or somehow save yourself, you are now forever forced to experience horror, in comparison to which a Dark Eldar raid would seem like a mundane routine. You could become part of a gigantic mound of living flesh, inside which impossible monsters gnaw tunnels, and you feel every move they make. You could become part of a new rotting garden, serving as food for numerous fungi and larvae, or simply join the chorus of constantly screaming voices that the Keepers of Secrets relish. Even all of the above does not reflect 0.01% of what can happen in such worlds. In the end, in the Immaterium, the concept of impossibility does not exist, and even a person with the richest imagination can always be surprised. And yet these are billions of people who have vanished without a chance for salvation or any further deliverance. And, if one considers the statistics, the chance of ending up among them is much higher than the chance of joining the ranks of the new Primaris Space Marines. The Imperium encompasses a vast array of entirely different planets, from death worlds to paradisiacal ones. Of course, life on such planets varies greatly, but even among the most inhospitable worlds, there are those you would least like to find yourself on. One such is Baal, the homeworld of the Blood Angels chapter. In ancient times, Baal and its moons, Primus and Secundus, had an atmosphere similar to Earth's, but while the planet itself was one vast red desert, its satellites were a paradise where humans lived freely in harmony with nature and in idleness. The local inhabitants built gigantic monuments, carved statues of rulers and gods in the rocks, and even travelled to the surface of Baal to create a colony and erect monuments. No one knows what exactly brought an end to this idyll. The only certainty is that during the terrible events marking the downfall of human society and the end of the Dark Age of technology, The moons of Baal suffered terribly when ancient viral and nuclear weapons were deployed on their surfaces. Cities turned into pale glass. After the lush vegetation, only dirty wastelands remained, and the seas were filled with toxic waste. Millions of people died, and it seemed that their kind would soon become extinct in the Baal system. But on the outskirts of the radioactive zones, there were those who desperately clung to life. They became scavengers, picking over the bones of their own once great civilization. In the dark times that followed, some fell even lower and turned to cannibalism. However, all this was before the coming of Sanguinius and subsequently the Imperium. After 10,000 years, Baal might not have become a paradise, but among other options, it certainly isn't the worst. Most importantly, it is there that the Blood Angels recruit their neophytes, and many would agree to endure the harsh climate for a chance to become one of the Imperial Angels. But what if you were unlucky enough not to have been born on Baal before the events, when the entire planet faced a trial that even many Astartes could not survive? At the very end of the 41st millennium, a tendril of the Hive Fleet Leviathan struck the planet. Hundreds of thousands of bioships, flying in such dense clusters that the invading force seemed like a single gigantic organism with numerous appendages, raced towards Baal. They were met with a frontal attack by the fleet of the Blood Angels, reinforced by starships from several successor chapter fleets. The skies of Baal erupted in a firestorm. The sturdy, massive ships of the Adeptus Astartes breached the center of the approaching Tyranid armada, unleashing devastating broadsides and volleys of torpedoes with nuclear warheads. However, their void operation was equally gallant and hopeless. The Xenos successively isolated combat barges and cruisers from their allies before dispatching them with organic missiles and swarms of smaller biocraft. Arriving in orbit around Baal and its moons, Leviathan spewed clouds of spores into the atmospheres of these celestial bodies. As a battle raged overhead, the warriors below awaited the opening onslaught of the Tyranids. Occupying positions on fortifications from the time of the Horus heresy, which had been excavated and reinforced by the Order's servants and servitors in preparation for the defense, the Space Marines transformed Baal and its twin moons into colossal fire traps, dotting their surfaces with artillery redoubts, minefields in narrow passes, and pillboxes with intersecting fields of fire. The first few swarms of Tyranids that landed in the Order's homeworld were completely annihilated under the volleys of well-aimed guns and devastating storms of bolter shells, not even managing to approach the Imperial defensive lines. However, new spores from low orbit kept landing on Baal every second, and the battle organisms, springing from the bursting fleshy envelopes of the Tyranids, immediately threw themselves into combat. By the time the 10th wave of invaders surged, the planet's surface was almost concealed beneath swarms of aliens. Towering over the living carpet of flesh were gigantic, synoptic creatures, the Tyranid hive tyrant, and immense tervigons, spawning gaunts by the dozens. These monsters commanded the surrounding creatures, incessantly bombarding the enemy with scorching plasma or breaching the fortifications with their massive limbs and blades. Wherever they made breaches, broods of Jinn stealers rushed in, turning the battle into frenzied hand-to-hand combat and slaughter. In the rear of the Tyranid swarms stood yet another mighty creature, which observed the slaughter, analyzing the strategic moves of the sons of Sanguinius, and directed its lesser kin to counter the Imperials. This monster demonstrated cunning and wittiness developed over entire epochs of warfare. The hive mind once again brought forth its messenger, the Swarm Lord, to ensure the eradication of the Blood Angels. Over several weeks of battle, the descendants of Sanguinius repelled 19 assault attempts, demonstrating valor and skill worthy of the memory of their fallen Primarch. The Flesh Tearers fought hand in hand with the Angels, soaked in blood, taking a circular defense. Warriors with blades and bolters repelled the onslaught of Tyranid warriors. The Blood Angels' assault squads dived into the thick of the enemy swarm, hunting the largest and most ferocious monsters. Among the radiation-scorched desert valleys, massed formations of armored vehicles and self-propelled guns clashed with attacking Carnifex broods. merging into a cacophony of metal and flesh. However, no matter how bravely the defenders of Baal fought, they simply could not stand. Each Tyranid attack took the lives of battle brothers. 5 masters of the successor chapters sacrificed themselves to hold back the surging waves of Xenos, but the higher the piles of corpses grew, the more it seemed that the heroism of the warriors was in vain. The fall of Baal seemed inevitable. In that dark hour, a new calamity befell the Baal system. A catastrophic discharge of Imperial energy occurred, splitting the galaxy with a colossal warp storm named the Great Rift. The sky above the homeland of Sanguinius burst into ethereal fire, and the ancient malevolent denizens of the Immaterium turned their terrible gazes upon tangible reality. Meanwhile, on Baal, the Blood Angels' successors unleashed their fury on the Tyranid swarms just as the brutal battle reached its zenith. Existence itself tore asunder, and the air smelt of boiling sulfur and burning, life-giving moisture. From the expanding breach, chanting praises to the blood god Khorne in unison, demonic legions charged. In the orbit of Baal, thousands of bioships disappeared, pulled into the Immaterium by tendrils of ethereal energy or consumed by fissures in space. Soon, only the burning hulls of gutted organic vessels remained in space. Entering the planet's gravitational well, they fell as a fiery rain upon the ravaged surface of the homeland of the Blood Angels. As the heavens opened to reveal a blazing hell, Dante, the chapter master of the Blood Angels, led a handful of surviving warriors who were retreating to the walls of the monastery fortress. The mad outbursts of the Empyrean intensified, and it seemed as if time itself had become its victim. The slaughter seemed to stretch on for years. Xenos and Space Marines continued to fight and kill, swiftly approaching mutual annihilation. At that decisive moment of the battle, the Swarm Lord itself joined the fray. Advancing forward, it cleaved the Space Marines to pieces with its serrated bony blades. Dante, weary and full of sorrow, yet still indomitable, hewed his way through the dense mass of alien flesh with his axe mortalis to reach the beast and decapitate it. They fought under skies ablaze, and the duel ended with the Lord of Angels, bleeding from a dozen mortal wounds, slaying the Swarm Lord. Dante himself collapsed soon after, and while warriors consumed by spiritual agony struggled to reach their commander's body, the tortured sky finally cleared. The storm has passed. Where the Tyranid armada had once obscured the stars, not a single enemy ship remained. In their place, majestic Imperial spacecraft appeared. Primarch Robot Guilliman, the resurrected Avenging Sun, arrived at Baal at the head of an irresistible crusade. These events are not simply referred to as the devastation of Baal. The chances of surviving such a battle, especially as a mere mortal, are incomparably less than the chances of being struck by lightning on a clear day while sitting at home. However, even if only for a short while, you would still have had the chance to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Imperial Angels in battle. The galaxy of the far future always offered plenty of chances to die, and one didn't even have to be part of apocalyptic events. But even in such a grim world, there are times and places where these chances virtually surge to 100%. However, the alternative is even worse, for there is no peace among the stars, only the laughter of thirsting gods.